The longer I occupy myself with the thought and writings of Erich Fromm, the more undeniable it becomes to me that Fromm's scientific legacy is a concept of social character, as already expounded by Michael Makovi. However, this concept is invariably used by Fromm in a judgmental, evaluative context. That is to say, the social or character orientations are distinguished from one another by whether or not they contribute to the person's psychic development, that is, whether they contribute to a productive effect which promotes human and psychic development, or to a non-productive impact on the self-fulfillment of the person and thus impede psychic growth or even thwart it. This humanistic ethical dimension is a central aspect of Fromm's scientific legacy. Since the mainstream of scientific thought advocates value-free research, instruction, and for the most part also application, and for good reasons, one need only remember what happens when science is kept on the leash by a political party, by the mullahs, or by the business world's interest in monetary return. Fromm's value-oriented understanding of science is regarded to many as obsolete. But even when Fromm's thought does indeed enjoy a good reception, it can be observed that there is a strong temptation to distinguish between the scientific Fromm and the religious, humanistic, or spiritual Fromm. An attempt is made in such cases to separate one from the other, as if Fromm had spoken with two voices. After a 10-year study of Fromm's life and work, Lawrence Friedman never tires in his biography of Fromm of trying to grasp the spiritual or prophetic Fromm in contrast to Fromm, the man of science. Such interpretations, and in my understanding misinterpretations, of Fromm's value-oriented scientific understanding becomes unnecessary when an attempt is made to perceive Fromm's understanding of science as an independent scientific paradigm, in which the value orientation of man and society are part and parcel of the object of scientific understanding. It is certain that the mainstream still stands today by altercations about freedom from value judgment in science, by relativism and constructivism in the behavioral sciences, and by an autocratic rule of the natural science paradigm, will not be convinced of this. However, one indication that a value-oriented understanding of science in the social sciences in the meantime is no longer quite obsolete, as is the new discussion set in motion above all by sociologists concerning the issue of alienation and the question concerning a good life, a good society, and good politics. Well worth reading in this context is a dissertation of Kieran Darkin, who is here, which will appear this coming autumn as a book entitled The Radical Humanism of Erich Fromm. It is a further indication that the question of a value-oriented social science is still thoroughly relevant today. Now I wish to show the individual reasons why Fromm arrived at this value-oriented concept of the human and social sciences. In doing so, I am not addressing here the Jewish tradition of thought from which Fromm came, that is Jewish orthodoxy and Hasidism, with its visions of men. The value orientation which formed part of his life are clearly reflected here in Fromm's own dissertation on the Jewish law, about which Jürgen Hardegg, and with great competence, Domagoj Akrab, who is also here, have already written. Over and above this, Fromm's sociological dissertation from the year 1922 clearly imparts the sense of a particular interest which guided his insights and which acted as a determinant of Fromm's social psychoanalytic research all during his life. That is, the question of what causes human beings who share in their practice of economic, social and cultural living to think, to feel and to act in a similar manner. Shortly after he finished his dissertation, Fromm was introduced by Frieda Reichmann to Freudian psychoanalysis. Its goal is to find out and make experiential the conscious and unconscious inner drives which cause the individual human being to think, feel and act in a certain manner. Fromm's stroke of genius, which he conceptualized in the context of questions considered relevant at the Institute for Social Research in the early 30s, was that he now brought together the sociological and psychoanalytical objects of understanding, that is, society and the individual, by showing that the societal aspect, with its requirements regarding life, survival and communal living, must be represented in each individual human being in the form of a libidinal structure formation. Thus, quotation, every society has its own distinctive libidinal structure, he coins at the beginning of his theorizing, which can be studied in the libidinal structure of the many individuals and causes these many individuals to think, feel, and act similarly. The study of this socially molded libidinal structure not only makes it possible to make statements about the impulses which are at work in a social group, but also explains why human beings passionately and gladly contribute whatever they must in the form of psychic and social acts of accommodation in order to bring about a successful communal life. Social requirements are thus internalized in this way and determine social drives in each of the many individuals. The problem caused by the insight that social drives, also socially caused on the one hand, stem from a libidinal structure formation on the other, was not an issue for Fromm at this time. The decisive point is a new determination of the relationship between the individual and society. In Fromm's socio-psychoanalytic approach, the two are no longer antipodes. Rather, society is present with its expectation in each individual in the form of libidinal impulses, and the individual cannot exist in any other way than as a social being. Fromm exemplified this approach for the first time in 1936 in his analysis of the authoritarian social character, published in the volume on Authority and Family of the Institute of Social Research, which has not been translated into English down to the present day. This very important paper. There are numerous indications that Fromm was increasingly doubtful about Freudian libido theory, by which Fromm in the first years explained the passionate strivings as libidinal drives caused by societal requirements. To be named here are, among others, Fromm's interest in matricentric cultures, his criticism of Freud's appraisal of the Oedipus complex, and his criticism of Freud's view of women. Also important, however, are Fromm's new contacts in the United States with Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and their cross-cultural anthropological studies, and with Harstek Sullivan, in whose view human beings are driven by an existential need for relatedness and not by the desire to satisfy libidinal wishes. In the winter of 1936-7, Fromm took time off for a few months to reformulate his social psychoanalytic approach more accurately and to delve into the basic principles of Freud's libido theory, as he wrote in a letter to his institute colleague Wittvogel. Quotation, I am trying to demonstrate that the urges which motivate social activities are not, as Freud supposes, sublimations of sexual instincts, rather products of social processes. End of quotation. In this 85-page long paper, Fromm states in detail his reasons for saying that most psychic structures are not only formed by the object relations of men, but are also independent of libidinal drives. Sullivan's relational approach naturally played godfather to Fromm's revision of psychoanalytic theory in the sense that the individual's underlying psychic problem is not the satisfaction of drives, but rather the satisfaction of his or her need for relatedness. For Fromm, however, every person must always stand in a relation not only with reality and with other human beings, as Sullivan made clear with his interpersonal and intersubjective approach. The hunger to be related to oneself and to the social group one belongs to arises with the same existential urgency from this relational approach. I skip now some pages because my time is limited, and I would have liked to say something about what happened with this paper, because it was never published until I found it in 1990 at the New York Public Library. And this is such a crucial point where you can see how Fromm managed and changed his idea once more and accommodated it on the relational basis. Now, I want to speak now of the implications by postulating some theses which go hand in hand with the social psychoanalytic approach developed by Fromm. First, I have already mentioned that Fromm's new determination of the relationship between individual and society, rather than standing opposite each other, they are structurally joined. And this is a reason why Fromm could say the following in his essay of 37, quotation, society is nothing but living concrete individuals, and the individual can live only as a social human being. In writing this, Fromm no longer takes societal institution as the starting point for defining the object of sociological studies, namely society, but rather the many individual persons, which was certainly one reason for the poor reception of Fromm's thought in sociology. More important, in my view, however, is that from the very beginning, Fromm understands the individual as a socialized being. This is also reflected in his expansion of Sullivan's relational approach and its postulate of the necessity for a relationship with oneself. This led Fromm, even at an early time, to clearly formulate a psychology of self in the end of the 30s, and on the other side, an existential hunger for ties to a social group, which leads to the development of an individual psychic structure and thus makes every type of psychology a form of social psychology. Every person has an inevitable need for relationship with a social group, and the formation of every psychic structure must satisfy the genetically pre-programmed need for a relationship not only with persons of reference, but also with a social group. It is my view that this primary sociality of man often receives too little attention in the reception of Fromm's thought, even though his thesis of escape from freedom expresses his idea even more clearly. Is based upon man's existential fear of the thought of an isolation. That's behind the book, is this a leading idea. Fromm expressed his idea even more clearly in his Beyond the Chains of Illusion in 1962. I quote Fromm: "For man as human being, that is to say, inasmuch as he transcends nature and is aware of himself and of death, the sense of complete aloneness and separateness is close to insanity. Man as man is afraid of insanity, just as man as animal is afraid of death. Man must enter into relationship with others. He must find union with others in order to remain sane. This need to be at one with others is his strongest passion, stronger than sex and often even stronger than the wish to live." The Fromm who speaks here is not only the sociologically trained psychoanalyst, but also the Jew who was born in Frankfurt almost exactly 36 years after the ghettoization law was finally lifted, who himself had to be isolated in 1931 due to his tuberculosis illness, who had to emigrate, and who himself experienced the stigmatization, the segregation, and the annihilation of some of his family's relatives by the Nazis. The view of man in his need for social attachment is a primary motive for Fromm's social psychoanalytic approach, an approach confirmed in turn by Bowlby, whose studies of attachment behavior were highly prized by Fromm. And this view undergoes further development in the sociobiological studies of which Maurizio Cortina will speak later, and in present-day research into relationships about which Sonja Gochmann will speak to us. If we view Fromm's social psychoanalytic approach against the backdrop of our deep-rooted fear of social isolation and the psychic structures whose formation it makes necessary, a number of other implications with theoretical impact come into view. Freud's concept of a primary narcissism, for example, and the notion that man is primarily self-sufficient and only secondarily in need of others in order to satisfy his instinctual needs, was emphatically rejected by Fromm and was criticized by him point by point in one of his later writings. The concept has also been quite clearly disproven by studies of infants and attachment. From the very beginning, every human person is a being in relation to reality, one who requires a bond with other individuals, to a social group, and to him or herself for his and her interactional behavior, his and her group behavior, and his and her self-regulation. In this regard, the latter, that is a relationship with oneself, has, in my view, and in that of Fromm himself, nothing to do with narcissism. However, this attachment behavior, which is guided by inherent affective reactions and attachment patterns, is subject to a process of development and, as it takes shape, is dependent for long periods on relational experiences which take root via internalization processes in the formation of psychic structure. It is precisely here that Fromm's social psychoanalytic approach takes effect, since it becomes important here to make a basic distinction between two different types of psychic structure formation, using their function as criteria, namely, first, those types which help to lay the foundation for the formation of individual character on the basis of quite individual circumstances and experiences in the first years of life, for example, parental divorce, the birth of a sibling, an unusual empathic motherly reference person, and so on. And secondly, those types which help to lay the foundation for the formation of social character on the basis of circumstances and experiences which are shared with a social group. For instance, being forced to assume a position of either rivalry or cooperation. In designating these types of psychic structure formation, Fromm took over the Freudian concept of character in the sense understood by Karl Abraham and taught at the Karl Abraham Institute in Berlin, where Fromm concluded his psychoanalytic training. After abandoning libido theory, Fromm appears to use the term character structure by and large as a synonym for the term psychic structure. The formation of psychic structure of character goes hand in hand with a decisive change in the dynamics of relatedness. Relational behavior becomes more and more independent of both real reference persons and of identification with a social group, since it is now guided by the internalized images of experiences and character orientations. That which we generally call autonomy development and the process of individuation always presupposes the development of a corresponding inner structural formation. Fromm's primary interest consisted in measuring man's being related in everyday life in light of the question of individuation. He did so in two directions. Firstly, it is necessary to identify the progress of the individuation process within a societal group and to determine how perception of the self and its convictions and values are basically defined pre-individually by the we of the collective, that is, by tradition, by the bonds of the family, and so on. And secondly, it is necessary to find out whether the step from the pre-modern to the modern, that is, from the collective to the individual sensing of one's self, can be done or actually is done, but is counteracted secondarily by a social character formation, by which the individual prefer to be dependent on authorities or today on technical acquirements which lie outside himself and herself, and which, with regard to the psychic processes of development and individuation, have a non-productive effect and alienate the person from his own individual powers and possibilities. It is therefore not enough to focus attention only on the necessity for relatedness. Rather, one must also always keep the type of relatedness and the quality of being related in view. This is all the more true inasmuch as one can also develop relational qualities and character orientations on the basis of one's ability to imagine and the ability to be conscious of oneself. Qualities and orientations unknown as such to his animal predecessors, but which enable human beings to express their love for nature, for instance, in a lyrical poem, or also to develop a permanent readiness for cruelty and destructiveness, and to make enjoyment in it. The study of character formation processes thus always goes hand in hand with a valuative question, namely the question of what impact character formation has upon a human being and his and her potential for development and individuation, as well as on human living with others. Is it humanely productive or non-productive? We are quite familiar with such value-oriented scientific questions which focus on the individual. Most branches of psychology are guided by concepts of what is healthy and what is pathological, and what allows the person to succeed or fail as a human being. Value-oriented science becomes far more complicated in a social psychoanalytic approach developed by Fromm, however, inasmuch as it takes two different structures formation processes as its point of departure. While it is true that the impact of the individual and the social character should be humanely productive, the task of the social character consists first and foremost in contributing to stability and to the successful outcome of a specific society. This functional determinant has the result that the social character often does not contribute to the individual's psychic success, but is rather directed toward a financial or social success, which can often be achieved only at the cost of a successful outcome on the part of the individual. One need only think of the subservient authoritarian character type, which is plagued by inhibitions and anxieties, or of those persons today who are ill from burnout. Thus, productive or non-productive quality can differ between the individual and the social character, so that an inner psychic conflict arises between the orientations of the two character formation processes, and can bring illness as a result. Such the conflict which Freud discussed between libidinal wishes and a cultural required renunciation of instincts is no longer present as such in Fromm's social psychoanalytic approach. Its place is taken by a potential conflict between the orientations of the individual and the social character and their respective productive or non-productive quality. Finally, it remains to be mentioned that Fromm's social psychoanalytic approach has also consequences for character study. The major challenge for empirical social character research consists in the fact that the persons involved are aware of social character orientation inasmuch as they are egocentric. That is to say, that most orientations are accessible to such persons only in their rationalizations. No test person will admit to an affinity for beating children or of being attracted by what is lifeless and inanimate. The persons involved are not allowed to be aware of their true character orientations. Likewise, a society built upon rivalry must suppress the awareness of how destructive it is if there are to be only winners and losers. The challenge, therefore, is as follows: to develop methods with which the socially unconscious and suppressed aspects of test persons can be studied empirically, and how to ensure that the researchers are aware of their own social character orientation and its respective influence on evaluation. The nearly last point, one important prerequisite of this, in my opinion, is to make a strict distinction between the basic striving, which is at work in character, and which Fromm called character orientation, and the character trait, which yield information only after recognition of the unconscious and conscious character orientation, which is at work in them. The instrumentarium of research must therefore be directed first and foremost to character orientation, since it is only this orientation which makes it possible to recognize the basic striving which is psychically at work. Work with behavioral observations, attitudinal studies, and character traits becomes socio-psychoanalytic in nature only when it focuses on character orientation. I believe that it is only in this way that one can do justice to the term psychodynamic character study. And finally, I come to my end. The term orientation of character is important in a social psychoanalytic approach in yet another sense. It is used by Fromm not only to designate individual non-productive social character orientations, the authoritarian, the hoarding character, the marketing character, narcissistic character, necrophilic character, but also to designate the productive or non-productive quality of character orientation. What is decisive in both uses of the term orientation is that it designates both the direction and the directedness of striving. That is something which attracts me rather than a place where I am. The above named implications of Fromm's social psychoanalytic approach make it clear why Fromm advocates a value-oriented understanding of science. Like that, by the way, which is fully a matter of course in medicine and therapeutic psychoanalysis. To sum up in a single sentence, if society, with its demands that every individual contributes to the successful outcome of society, is represented in the social character of the many individuals, then the conflict between what makes society successful and what makes a person successful will be avoidable only if the conditions for living together in a society are also oriented toward the successful outcome of human beings. For Fromm, it was the case that mental health cannot be defined in terms of the adjustment of the individual of his society, but on the contrary, that it must be defined in terms of the adjustment of society to the needs of man. For me, Fromm speaks only with one voice, which goes against the mainstream of today's understanding of science, a voice which says the successful outcome of man as man must be the value which science takes as its point of orientation.